So welcome. Thanks everyone for joining. I'm Alexa Clay, the RSA US Director. In today's session, we're covering the new world of work after the pandemic. Who are the winners and losers? We'll explore how the pandemic has changed the world of work. And this is part of a broader conference theme, moving from crisis management to a progressive transition of societies and systems. For those joining in, if you could please introduce yourself in the chat function, where you're calling in from. I'm joined today by three brilliant panelists. We've got Alan Lockey from the head of the Future of Work Center at the RSA, my colleague. Tara McGinnis, who's the founder of the New Practice Lab at New America and co-author of a new book. Congratulations, Tara. Power to the Public, The Promise of Public Interest Technology. And then Esther Lynch, Deputy General Secretary of the European Trade Union Confederation. In terms of today's format, each panelist will have 5 minutes for opening remarks. Feel free to put any questions that you might have in the chat function for our panelists to respond to. I'll be calling out questions continuously, and then we'll switch over to a moderated discussion. So first, I'm going to hand over to Alan for opening remarks.
Thank you, Alexa. An absolute pleasure and privilege, as always, to be at this conference. So, I mean, the question broadly for this panel is who has been the winners and losers, and who and what are the biggest changes coming out of the pandemic? As we hope, are beginning, at least in the West, to move out of the acute phase. I think, I will mainly speak and reflect on the UK experience. I will be interested to see if the experience across Europe and North America. But basically, there are three broad groups within the labour market, and they've all had a very, very, very divergent experience with a lot of unequal outcomes. And those three groups are, one, what we might call the remote workers, who have had a fantastic pandemic, at least in terms of their economic security, and have done very, very well out of consumption being stripped out of the economy, and have also had the ability, at least relatively, to work in a safe environment. Not entirely safe. There's going to be a rise in musculoskeletal injuries over the next few years, I should imagine, from poor home offices, but it's definitely a much safer environment from the perspective of the virus. Second is the key worker group, who are obviously, to a large extent, and this is in the UK at least, public and private. Our social care system is a mixed provision, but also, of course, many parts of retail are private sector and classified as key workers. They've obviously worked very hard. Their economic security is decent, but they're really burnt out, and they are now facing some severe well-being, mental health challenges, as you would expect, really. I mean, they're really at the front line, and of course we're very, very, very exposed, and some of the death rates for some of the workers in this group, particularly in the private sector, actually, and we look at occupations such as bus drivers, have been very, very high, and that's where it sort of interacts with kind of pre-existing socioeconomic disadvantage. And then three is the kind of really heterogeneous group, which we might call the kind of COVID sensitive workers. And you know, there are people who, and this group is broad and probably includes everyone who at least some point was shut down by lockdown restrictions. Some people in this group, like construction workers, construction is booming in the UK at the moment, and they managed to get back on site very, very quickly and were prioritised in terms of COVID secure support. Some workers in here, hospitality, leisure, obviously the aerospace travel industry, I mean, they really, really have been hit very, very hard. Parts of retail and still, in some cases, not much of an outlook. And many of these people are on as in a lot of Europe, a kind of short-time working scheme, furlough scheme, been generously supported by the government, but there's still questions about their long-term future and viability even in the next 12 months. I'll just do a kind of quick tour of what the big changes in each of those groups are, I think, going forward. For the hybrid workers, we now reach, for the remote workers, we're now reaching a point where they could become hybrid workers. And all the evidence that we've collected, and everyone really in the UK, is that workers really, really want this. They're really, really optimistic about it. There's not really much evidence in the way that productivity has declined. In fact, if anything, it might have gone up, although we have some questions about how sustainable that is, at least from a well-being and burnout perspective. People are working harder. People are, people are working extremely hard during the pandemic from their home office, and there's a kind of blurring of boundaries, obviously, between home and the office. But people are really up for it, and the sense is that they may be going back into the office with a different perspective on well-being, a different perspective and expectations on flexible working. And I think there's a really positive story for these workers who have also had relatively high economic security throughout the crisis. The key challenge there, and this is a big one, is what does that do for the political economy of place? And so the worry for me is that you move to a hybrid model in cities like London and Manchester and Birmingham, and then some of the retail workers, the hospitality workers, the leisure industry workers in those cities are both then the hardest hit by the virus in the first place, and perhaps hit hard by behavioural change going forward. As demand for their labour is sucked out of their community. For the key workers, we've reached this kind of junction in the UK where, for all of the clapping at the start and for all of the upswing and general sense of we need to make sure that these people who have saved us and have kept us safe during the crisis are rewarded fairly going out of it, the energy for that has gone. Nurses have been given a 1% pay rise this year by the government, which is an insult, to be perfectly honest. Social care remains the most vulnerable in terms of labour market protection sector in the UK. Nothing seems to be being done about this. There's no social care bill in the government's bill, and that kind of and the immediate future for that is a supply crisis. And so some of these sectors are also Brexit sensitive, as well as pandemic sensitive, but there are already supply crises that you can see because of burnout and because of and then finally, on the last group, that this is perhaps the most interesting and where it interacts with what I think is the biggest macro question for the future of work in the next 5 years, 10 years, which I will definitely defer to the rest of my panel on this, which is what happens to worker power now? There's a really interesting point in many of the sectors at the moment. Look at hospitality, look at construction, huge labour shortages. And wages rising now because of that, and potentially inflationary pressure because of that as well. Now, why? It's a really complex story. Construction, hospitality, very, very high immigration. And so a lot of immigrants left during the pandemic. Immigration has fallen. That's obviously a very Brexit sensitive issue as well. But is there a moment where workers are in a buying power within the labour market and can leverage up their terms and their conditions? A lot of workers in these sectors are still on 80% furlough. When you're, looking at, even if your job is kind of has a long term, perhaps it's not viable because it's, you work in the air industry, you work in tourism. Do you want to sit on furlough for 80% and wait for a good work opportunity, or do you want to go into social care now, which has very poor terms and conditions? So there is an opportunity perhaps to leverage up good work terms and conditions. And I think that connects to the big question for me, which is, the biggest challenge in the UK, and I think this is worldwide, it's obviously more pronounced in the UK and the US, is how to leverage up worker power. We have a president for the first time, really, and that includes Democrats, in a long time, who is a very, very unabashedly pro-Labour union. The key sort of driver of economic security for me that is sustainable and systemic is to increase worker power. We have a moment in the UK where we have supported workers in policy sense with a very, very generous economic security package, will that change attitudes, and will people return to the labour market thinking more and looking more for good work, high terms and conditions, and can we use that to leverage power within the economy, stakeholder power within the economy?
Great, thanks, Alan. We're going to return to some of these themes around worker power and the union revival, but want to hand it over now to Tara for opening remarks.
Sure, thank you. And it's delightful to be with you all. I'm Tara McKinnon. I lead something called the New Practice Lab at New America. That is a lightweight lab with folks who do the kind of worker and labor market policy and research akin to the tremendous work Alan does. But we have one foot in the world of delivery and design. So we include researchers and designers in our shop to think about how these things like portable benefits or unemployment insurance or frankly raising care wages really meet the person at the end of this. I'll speak briefly and I'll say much of what Alan said really resonated. While I do think there are differences between the perspectives in the United States and Europe, there are truly some resounding similarities. And just to touch on a few, I think this question of worker power is among them. Maybe I'll just start by saying the pandemic, frankly, brought us no new problems. It really truly exposed the through lines of existing weakness in our social policy architecture. I'm going to really lean heavily into the kind of United States because that's my area of expertise, but I'd love to flesh out in conversation whether this is resonant. And just to say, we had transformational changes in the American family structure in really 2 decades, going from having a single household breadwinner to most families in the United States have 2 breadwinners with no commensurate transformation in social policy. And while we knew this, nothing exposed this more than the global pandemic, the kind of true nexus between the labor workforce and the systems that we have, whether it's early care or aftercare or home care for the elderly. And I think if there is one profound insight, it is the amplification of the intertwined nature of the labor market and care in the United States. And so I think while it was true before, I would have hoped we could have solved it without the pain and suffering of this pandemic. But it is an aspiration, I think, for progressives to now make what is seen acted upon. The second piece, again, it predates, weakness that predates the architecture of the pandemic. Is the nature, and Alan touched on this, that wages have not kept up with productivity and the strong decline in union density, again, made truly visible in a moment. I think I take a strong critique to the media coverage in the United States. Our leading publications would really make it seem like most people are doing what I'm doing, which is putting on a suit jacket with yoga pants and working from home. That is a minority of American workers. And so I think making visible the true bifurcation of the American workforce into those whose wages have kept up and who've done profoundly better through the pandemic, and those, you have 16 million Americans who make less than $15 an hour, even with our wage gains. That's a large number of American families. You can't run a country like that. So I'd kind of take us back to be clear-eyed about the pandemic has clarified 2 major structural weaknesses, which is the benefits and wages of workers that have, for most Americans, have not kept up, and the tremendous shift in how we architect our families that has no commensurate policy. Where does this lead us? And Alexa, I want to wave your arms so I can make sure I do this on tight. I think tremendous possibility in the visibility of the care sectors. Early, you see this in the Biden administration's early plans. That kind of a long-standing table, which has the economists in some place of higher power in a White House or congressional architecture, and those who care about things like paid leave and early education somewhere else. The knitting of these two, the vast departure of women from the labor market in particular that has clarifying race lines and Latinas in the United States who have pulled out, I think is pushing people to a set of solutions that see something like the largest investment in childcare, which that President Biden has laid out since World War II, as directly relational to how we think about our broader labor market. Second, the clarifying the need for low-wage workers. I hope maybe I'm a little glass more full than Alan. I think the pot and pan banging, while has not yet resulted in structural shifts for frontline workers, I do think the visibility and dependency of people of upper classes who were in their homes having food delivered, and the kind of data and stories about frontline workers have at least done a deeper education on a set of class of workers: grocery store workers, emergency workers, orderlies, not just nurses, that I hope will have made for us, visible this growing sector of the economy. And then finally, I'll just say a word, and this is my my own soapbox. I think for folks in Europe, you guys are years ahead on thinking about delivery, but nothing made, for those of us who think deeply about big ideas and the next generation of social policy, nothing made the importance of delivery more visible than every single project to help massive populations across the US and Europe. Vaccine distribution is a delivery problem and a website problem. Unemployment insurance, working for this new and 1/3 in the United States class of workers in the gig economy, is a delivery challenge. For us, I think the third piece I would add is the clarifying nature of how passing a policy, allocating the dollars is not enough in when our institutions, at least in the United States, were designed almost 100 years ago to have a different purpose. And I think creating both the ideas and the government architecture that allows you to act quickly in a moment of crisis, but sustain these new innovations. So much of our government services were in person prior to the pandemic, whether that was food assistance or unemployment assistance. Some agencies made the shift, some did not, and their populations suffered. But the need to kind of think about the end delivery as we architect the next generation of ideas. One final piece, and I'll turn it back to you, Alexa, is pronounced learning that our institutions are not poised to serve what is now a new class of workers in the gig economy. The ways that we deliver social services in the United States, we made a creative play on, changing unemployment insurance to make it, responsive to gig workers. It resulted in a huge amount of fraud. We are not positioned to see the class of workers that is the fastest growing class of workers, and for how we help people in these interim and crisis times. Creating structures that really reach people who are outside the traditional architecture remains an enormous challenge. So I'll stop there. Thank you for having me. I'm hoping that is what has been exposed leads us to solutions that we've been debating for ages.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tara. And I think we'll have time to go more into some of those structural transitions and what that looks like for the next 10 years. Want to hand over now to Esther, if you want to share your opening remarks, and then we'll move into more of a moderated Q&A. So as you have questions for our panelists, please just drop them into the chat function and we'll be picking them up. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexa. And we really want to thank Alan and Tara because they've helped me get a bit clearer in what I was going to say as well. So I remember when I was a teenager, my favorite topic in class was geography. We learned in geography about fault lines, about how you could predict where an earthquake was going to happen because of fault lines. And so I think it's helpful in looking at what we can do about the winners and losers to look at where in the labor movement in Europe, we see some of the fault lines where they might be beginning to become visible. And the first of those is exactly this question of time and place sovereignty. And while there absolutely is a huge interest among workers for hybrid working, there's also a similar interest among employers for hybrid working. And those interests don't always coincide because it's who gets to choose. It's who gets to choose what hours, who gets to choose the place, and who gets to choose, and whose right is it to say, no, I don't want to work at home. Like, do you have a right now to say that you don't want to do that? And what are the consequences of not getting on board the new culture of hybrid working? And I say that we were saying that when we came in, I have the luxury of, I live alone, and I have Wi-Fi. I have good Wi-Fi. I live in a part of the world where you can have good Wi-Fi. But I know from the type of meetings I have that I see a lot of young people in particular who are quite clearly squashed in some corner of a bedroom somewhere, and there's an awful lot going on behind them. And I think that hybrid working for me and hybrid working for them is a very different thing. So I think one of the first fault lines that we say is developing is a dangerous assumption that hybrid working will always be the choice of the worker. I think that will only happen if we do something to make sure that happens. So we need to make it an explicit right. The other piece closely attached to this question is whether people who are remote working, whether the subtle and not so subtle attempts by some employers to pay people less or to treat them differently, to say, okay, you can keep your telework going and we can have hybrid work, but we're not going to have the bonuses. I can't be sure about whether you'll get put forward for promotion. And depending on where you live, we'll pay you differently. That we need to make sure and stop that dead in its tracks now, because the temptation always to invent new categories of workers as a justification to pay them less or treat them differently always needs to be guaranteed it doesn't happen, whether it's agency workers, part-time workers. Like throughout my working life, we've always had to stamp that out and make it very explicit. The right to equal pay, the right to equal treatment if you are doing hybrid work. The third thing then is that the employer should pay, because it's a benefit to the employer if you're working at home. So the costs of running the office, the costs of the Wi-Fi, the costs of the equipment should be borne by the employer. The fourth issue then is this question of surveillance, we're collecting quite worrying reports where people are being spied on in there because they're working in their bedroom or they're working in their kitchen, and so this monitoring is now in people's own homes, and the workers are not always, number one, aware of when they're being monitored, or number two, they do not have control of turning it off. So if you like, we need to make sure, again, the sovereignty of being able to switch off the monitoring, of know you're being monitored, is put into the hands of workers and isn't, we say, left to the goodwill of a well-meaning employer. And everybody else who doesn't have a well-meaning employer just has to fight it out themselves. That we need to make sure that there is an ethical framework of rights that workers can rely on, and importantly, that workers and their unions collectively can rely on, because it's all too easy to single out individual workers and get them to sign away their rights to privacy individually. It's harder to do that with the whole workforce, where people are sticking together with their workmates saying, no, we're not going to put up with this. But once you can pick people off on the most vulnerable day, the day they're asking for the job. So we need to make sure that privacy is not possible to be signed away simply on your first day when you're desperate to get the job and the contract. I think then the real concern as well has been, because of the pandemic, everybody has been taking a very pragmatic approach. And the pragmatic approach has meant that people did a bit of work, stopped, homeschooled the children, got back to doing work, but that meant that their working day started maybe at 7 and finished at midnight. And that happened for 18 months. And so we need to find some way of getting back to a working day and a working week, which will not bring about overwork death. So they are, if you like, that there are so many questions surrounding the hybrid work, and yes, workers want it if they're sovereign in terms of place, so they get to choose, sovereign in terms of the time, they get to choose, and that the costs are borne by the employer, and that the amount of work that's needed to be done can reasonably be achieved, and that they have the full possibility to switch off the surveillance. I know I'm running out of time, but there's just 2 more fault lines I'd like to flag up. The other of those is exactly this question of money. It's an old issue, but it's a new issue. It's always an issue. So how much fair wages is always contested. And I think one of the interesting things that we have noticed now is a challenging of all of those workers who nobody really noticed, exactly as Tara said, nobody really noticed a lot of workers. And we certainly didn't realize that they were essential. And now we know that. And now we have to do something about that. So it can't be the case that we ask people to show up, put their lives on the line and deliver a service. And then we say to them, yeah, and you get minimum wage. And minimum wage doesn't even pay you enough to put food on the table or to put a roof over your head. So there really needs to be a strong support for workers to join unions so that they can bargain for work which is properly valued, and that all of their skills that they bring to bear in that work is properly valued. Because the most important person in the workplace was the cleaner. The cleaner was what stood between people having a safe workplace and an unsafe workplace. So it can't be the case that that person is paid minimum wage. So there does need, exactly as Alan said, there needs to be a building up of workers so that they can join unions without fear. And when they join a union, they have their right to collective bargaining properly recognized. And I can't tell you what a bright light Joe Biden being in the White House is at the moment, even throughout Europe, because it shows that this is not about ideology. This is about justice and making sure that people have their fundamental right to join a union recognized. And my third and final point is the safety nets. And there's 2 types of safety nets that became fault lines. One of those was people's personal savings. So we saw when we went into the pandemic research that said 1/3 of people when we went to the pandemic had no savings. Not a surprise if you're on minimum wage that you've no savings. Yeah. The second group had savings, but only for 8 weeks. And then the third group had sufficient savings. So part of this being the role of the state and the important role of the state, and a renewed interest and understanding that the state can actually play an important role in making sure that if you don't have work, that there is resources and supports available for you. The other part of the safety nets is the safety nets for jobs moving forward. So in terms of anticipation of change and getting access to the type of skills that are going to bring you forward in your career, and so that you can secure the type of work and get sufficient security in your job, both in terms of by strong trade unions within the firm, but also strong trade unions within the firm, making sure that you're getting access to skills that will allow you to advance to. I think workers are increasingly asking for that type of negotiation in the workplace, which is also about preparing for the future. Back to you, Alexa.
Thank you, Esther. Great to just have your points brought up, really surfacing the power of bargaining power, and both for hybrid workers and for essential workers. So want to pick up on some of your optimism around the Biden moment that we're in and unions. But first, maybe just invite a reflection around this question of ripeness for change. It's a term we throw around a lot at the RSA, but basically ask, do we feel like there's momentum to reconsider the role of work now in society? Alan, I know that you were thinking a lot around the shifting social contract around work, and how has the pandemic really accelerated, that need? do we feel, Christopher Hill, the historian, often talks about, a door for change swinging open widely. And other times, social change feeling like something that's really hard won, that's a sort of gradual chipping away of the status quo. And so, Tara, you shared a bit about just how much this pandemic has made visible some of the structural weaknesses we face. And so, what now of structural engineering? What do we feel like there's now a moment of opportunity for actually kind of, setting a policy agenda for the next 10 years that can be truly progressive? How optimistic do we feel about the ripeness for change in this moment? Alan, do you want to share with your thoughts first and maybe just tie in some of the social contract thinking that you've been doing?
Oh, wow. A big question. Look, I mean, I think let's start with a kind of very simplistic, which Tara can obviously challenge, a view of what I think happened in America, which draws on UK history a little bit, which is, the contingency of politics is important, and getting your election in the crisis or the aftermath of the crisis is a massively important thing. The biggest social contract change in the UK case history, at least in terms of a big bang, was the 1945 Labour government. And the UK is not going to have a 1945 moment in this pandemic, but America, it looks like they did, because of the timing of the election, and also because of some of the stuff that went around after and the lead up to the election, especially after. It feels like a massive opportunity for America that they really need to just, keep the foot to the accelerator and go for it, and they are. So it's really, really important, and it's good for Europe. It's good for the UK because it is particularly in the UK, it's a real challenge to our vision of America and the values that we associate with America, which then bleed into the UK politics in particular. I don't know if that's necessarily true across Europe in quite the same way. Due to language and cultural history reasons, we really sort of, I don't know, feed in off the American conversation quite a lot. So that's good. However, I'm not massively optimistic about the UK, because I think there's a real battle in the heart of the government at the moment, where you have a Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who would happily go along with a very, very Biden approach, to be perfectly honest. And there's a view of Johnson abroad that he's many things, but he's an ultimate shapeshifter, and he would happily lean in. His Chancellor and the Treasury, which is the single most fiscally conservative institution in the UK, probably the world, is having none of it. So that's where the 1% pay rise for nurses comes from. I don't see that care. Social care has been the biggest policy challenge in the UK for the last 4 decades. Everything that Tara said about the US system is true in the UK. I think in many areas of the welfare state, the UK, and through the pandemic, the UK is a little bit more European, not Nordic, but more European than America. But on social care, it's a disaster zone, and I don't see that being solved. So I'm pessimistic about that. I'm pessimistic therefore about if you look at those kind of 3 different workers. I'm optimistic about the hybrid workers. I see a value shift, which I think will get recognised. I think, Esther sketched out many of the issues to do with that, and the kind of the protections that are needed for the flexibility to be two-sided. But I think I'm relatively optimistic that will happen, because I think there's been a value shift. I think there's been a value shift on the safety net too, perhaps, but that one jury's out. I think the government will maybe try and resist some of the things and resist moving towards a more generous welfare state, will resist moves towards more active labour market policy. But I think the jury's really out on that one. But I'm very pessimistic on the prospects for the key workers in the UK. I think there was a it's not even really a value shift. The thing about the UK is that they're obsessed with the NHS, and you could get people out in the streets clapping for nurses outside of a pandemic too, and yet the fiscal settlement continues not to recognise their value. So I don't see any massive change there. So I'm particularly pessimistic about the unrecognised value shift in that one. So 1.5 across 3 groups for a new social contract. With the sad thing being that the one most optimistic about is people who probably need a new social contract, at least more.
Great, thanks, Alan. So not quite the kind of rah-rah we have for the next 10 years of progressive action. But Tara, I want to shift over to you. And you've just written this new book, really looking at public interest technology. I think there is a subcurrent in American society today where we've really become fatigued with big tech. And so I'm wondering if you can just help, make the connection for folks around the role of public interest technology and the role that, government has to play in some of these delivery systems, and in kind of wrestling that ethos of tech away from the sort of Silicon Valley elite and making it something that's much more participatory and owned by people and has a democratic mandate.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And, this is somewhat personal for me. I spent much of my life's work in organizing, communicating, and passing big policies, and had every gray hair you see on my head came from my experience working on the Affordable Care Act. But I really found that there's an elitism in the progressive circles and policy circles, that we care a lot about the big ideas, but actually how they feel to the people that are receiving them is an enormous gap. And I think even the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare really came within a hair of having over a decade and a half of massive social policy and organizing die on our ability to deliver. And so most of the book, just to take 2 parts, I think there's a question about the power of monopoly of big tech. But part of what I'm making the case is that for those of us who care deeply about the role of any of these items we discussed, from kind of holding employers accountable on worker rights to really even the oversight of raising wages, that we have governments that were built in a different time, and that we need to care more deeply about their ability to modernize. And I don't just mean digitize. A lot of the solutions we talk about in our book are things like a staple. I think there's a lot of faddishness to technology fixing. If someone says they have an app that will fix homelessness, they are a fraudster. But that there is a deep role that technology has used in the private sector to create these enormous economic gains that is not being applied to our social problems. And so we kind of in the book highlight what we see are a trend around the world of people putting humans at the center, kind of human-centered design. This is not a new practice. It's anthropology. It's organizing, using data in real time to instrument how things are working, for workers or others, and thinking it through, like starting small before you try something big. And we did a lot of big things in pandemic. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. But our ability to have kind of governments that learn and move towards the things that work. On the tech side, I think this is formidably challenging. I mean, part of what we're suggesting is take these practices that have, really created an enormous amount of wealth and use them for the public good. On the fault lines, I think, to use Esther's term, of the vulnerability between the enormous wealth gains and the workers in these tech systems, including the monitoring and companies like Amazon and Walmart, are real. And I think, to pick up on where Alan left off, the moment, I think, for workers is here. I served twice now for President Joe Biden, leading his domestic policy team in the transition. It is one of these moments where the movement moment meets a person who, in his gut for his entire career, from his family orientation, has a visceral sense about the dignity of workers, all workers. And I do think there's enormous possibility in that. And that is both responsive to the kind of political environment, but who President Biden is. And I think that back when we see cataclysmic, good happen, it often takes this combination of good work in the field and someone who really can carry it forward. And I think I have a ton of confidence about, him as president to lead in this area of workers. The challenge, I think, is often in the details. Both we talked here about the bifurcation of I don't think we know how to build power for this class of workers who are not unionized, who are now, hybrid workers. I think the role of employers in the United States, especially on the tech sector, of seeing the moment, of backlash which has begun, but could this be I get advertisements every day from Walmart and Amazon saying that they moved to 15, which one of them did and one of them didn't. And it's just good, marketing. They're sensitive. Companies are sensitive to this, but are they sensitive in a way that they're Henry Fords of our generation and say, actually, the distance between the top and the bottom is unsustainable. And so I will either be a partner in thinking this work through in a meaningful way, or I will be brought there by the masses. And I think there is a role for that. If a single model employer broke off at the top in the United States, it could be transformational for the organizing of the rest of the field in this technology space. And I think it's tremendously complex, but I do think we need equal strategies at kind of the top for the middle workers and for those who are the most scrutinized by some of the kind of the digitization and monitoring that Esther described. So I think you can hear my optimism. I think the place where I can't see the path is on the details for how you can't organize these workers in the way you did in 1929. Right. And so I think we need more creativity in the models. And it's not going to be the same for drivers of Amazon vehicles as it is for reporters who are happy now to work from their home offices. It's going to take a real variety of models.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tara. And Esther, I wonder if you can come in on this point, really just thinking about, the maybe Americans being optimistic with our Biden moment, but from a European perspective, what are some of the things we should be thinking about as we embark on, 21st century organizing and creating new forms of worker power? How are you seeing the role of digital and tech play into that a little bit?
So I had a conversation with a union organizer in Romania, and he was trying to organize workers, and he got a letter from the employer saying, you can't share emails with everybody because that's against the general data protection regulation. And that demonstrated to me that all too often things that start out as a good idea for us end up being subverted and used against us. So it also told me that employers were afraid of digital trade organizing, that they obviously see that this is something that can work. So unions throughout the European Union are now investing heavily, including the ETUC, in trying to develop our own safe platforms that will allow workers to meet each other and to have the equivalent of what I would have had as a meeting in the back of a pub online. But I don't want to replace the back of the pub meeting, because the back of the pub meeting, it's old school, old fashioned, but it works. And it's about building communities. And it's about allowing people to hang out with each other and to discuss with each other the real life problems that they're experiencing in the workplace, and then to become active agents in change and changing it themselves. And so I think that we need to have we need to be everywhere where workers are, as we always were in the past. What worries me, though, is we have a number of platforms in Europe who claim that they're not employers. So one of the biggest challenges used to be that employers fail to recognize trade unions, but now they fail to recognize themselves. And they pretend that there's something other than an employer, even though courts everywhere are telling them that they are in fact employers. And I think we could do with the help of the state in being very clear in not allowing employers to dodge all their obligations, and to take what's going on a little bit more seriously in that regard. Because the danger, and I agree that the comment about women on hybrid work. We saw that with university professors. Men were able to produce a lot more, male university professors were able to produce a lot more papers during the pandemic than women university professors were. Yeah. So there is a real risk that hybrid working pushes women back into the workplace, where you have to do your day at work plus everything that's coming up at home. But also the risk is that if your tie is no longer in the workplace, then what's the glue that holds you and your workmates together if you never see each other and never meet each other? And that is definitely something that we're aware of and thinking very actively about. And maybe it's about building trade unionism around communities as much as it is about particular workplaces, and then taking on the type of challenges, the type of social justice challenges that are facing us in Europe, the UK, or indeed the US.
Wonderful. Thank you, Esther. And great to see your comment, Petra, in terms of just bringing in the gender dimension to this conversation, which I think is so important. I just want to switch gears now and really think about, our own prioritization of a progressive agenda. What would be on your wish lists for governments for the next decade? How do we prioritize economic security, well-being for workers? What would be, kind of the top of your list in terms of priorities that we could organize around? And for whoever feels like they can jump in first.
I'm happy to start. And I do want to foot stamp that we got this far in this conversation without stating very plainly the pronounced inequality on gender and in the United States on race that has been exposed by this is a kind of personal, I'll own the personal shortfall. It is all of the things. It is in some ways that it's at the core of the remarks I was making about the importance of care. It took losing hundreds of thousands of female workers for experts to see the connection between care and workforce. It shows the gendered nature of our deciders, but I think we're a bit more on the path. So the agenda, I was like, where do we start? 1, wages. 2, wages. 3, wages/power. I do think that so many of our solutions here in the United States, and even if we hit home runs on early education and paid leave and reducing the cost of healthcare, are workarounds for the absence of wages growing with productivity. And I do think the crooked path is probably worker powered to wages, but also creativity on how you raise wages and recognize value in early educators and long-term care workers, which will make up across our countries a huge share. So I'd say 1, kind of creativity there. 2, this blending of, and many of you are farther along this, really seeing social investments in the early years of life as deeply connected to the productivity of a country. The brain forms by the time children are 3. Similarly, really seeing investments in, the President Biden put $400 billion into home and community-based services. That will be a truly transformational investment if it raises the wages of those workers. It will be the creation of terrible jobs for 1.9 million women of color if it isn't twinned. So this twinning of the wages and the power, and really in particular how that shows up in care, the kind of care, and I don't mean, which is many things, and seeing care as kind of deeply connected to how we think about labor growth would be my one and 2 kind of prioritization. But I think ending where I started, in the United States, the inequalities on gender and race are profound, and we've confined this conversation to workers, but how the equality shows up and whose wages are raised and who gains power here must be responsive to this historic inequity for women and people of color. And it is if you anchor into care, which is both what the workers need and who are the care workers. And so I think that is a, really potentially powerful place for massive social justice gains that are both responsive to where we are in the economy, but that really do meet a moment that is about seeing, communities of color in the United States.
Wonderful, Tara. Thank you. Alan or Esther, do you want to come in terms of your wish list and agenda for the next kind of 10 years of progressive policymaking?
Maybe I'll go and that will allow Alan to wrap up like this. So I'm going to raise three. So the first one is just to restate what Tara says, because it's so good it should be named twice, which is it's absolutely necessary for member states to have an enabling framework that supports workers to be able to join a union without fear and to bargain for their fair share of the productivity and the profits and the wealth and everything else that they're helping to create. And that doesn't mean governments standing back and saying, well, isn't that a pity that that's not happening? It means active involvement and support and protection. And importantly, it needs to end the union busting tactics that are going on, whether that's online or whether it's private security firms or prestigious law firms or whoever's doing it. That needs to, there needs to be an end to that old school retro 120, 150-year-old type of activity of frightening people out of joining the union. And importantly, then there also needs to be protection for trade unions, because more and more the trade unions themselves are coming under attack in the world. And so there needs to be a real effort by governments to make sure that trade unions and the officials can go about their job. And what I mean by that is going to meet the workers and finding, and having a conversation with them, and to be able to do that without the police arresting them. And it's hard to believe that happens in Europe, but it does. So if you like that, the only way that we have a fair recovery is if we make sure that workers can bargain, so to get more money in their pockets, and then they can spend it in the local towns. And then the windfall profits that have been made during the pandemic by some firms, that we can manage to get some sharing back into the economies, and I think that always frustrates me in the discussions, and in particular, Alan, because I watch BBC obviously, and that always frustrates me in the conversations, that there's no evaluation of the collective benefit of collective bargaining. That there's only this small kind of small misunderstood approach to the importance of putting money into workers' pockets. But anyway, that's definitely the first one. The second one is in the same way as Tara has mentioned, the communities very affected. I would also like to put on the idea of re-evaluating the work that's predominantly done by women. And what I mean by that in particular is care and emotion work. And I think that looking to the future, artificial intelligence and robots are going to do an awful lot of the physical work and an awful lot of the mundane work. And the work that's going to be done by a lot of women is going to be the problem-solving, high-touch piece of the work. And currently that is massively undervalued. And I think that this re-evaluation of work that's predominantly done by women, and if you like, making visible its value and being able to bargain on its value, is going to be critical to make sure that the future world of work pays properly. I think we're doing quite a lot of work on that in Europe at the moment with a draft law that's being discussed about bargaining for work of equal value, equal pay for work of equal value. And that's going to be quite an exciting thing we're going to be looking at. Then finally, I want to go back to this skills issue. I think that it's critical for the benefits, again, of everybody, that the workforce gets access to training throughout their working life, not just when they become unemployed. That it has to be that you get a guarantee of information about where the careers are going, what type of skills are needed for the future, and then you're supported to get those skills. At the moment, there's there's way too much attention in discussions with employers about what the skill needs they want, and almost like an acceptance that a certain percentage of the workforce would just be like put on the scrap heap or something. Like, you know, there isn't enough challenging of that as an unsustainable way to run the labor market. That what needs to happen is that the workers are constantly enabled to get access to training and skills for the future. So they're the three. I've got a lot more, but I can only have three. So they're the three I take.
Brilliant. Thanks, Esther. If we've just got about 10 minutes left, so if anyone has any questions, please share them in the chat function. We'll try and weave them in. And Alan, do you want to come in on this point?
Yeah, I mean, all of the above. First, I mean, we talk about a social contract. A social contract is a shift in norms and values and attitudes towards the economy. And frankly, at least in terms of the perceptions that people have about the economy, it changed in 2008. It just hasn't been recognised, and it's changing again now. And so, what do we need? For systemic reasons, we need unions interweaved within the social contract and seen as they used to be in a tripartite system alongside employers in the state. We definitely need a more inclusive and equitable economy across gender and race. And you know, as soon as you start to look at it from that perspective, as Tara suggested, it's the same in the UK. The amount of BAME migrant labour predominantly that we use in the care sector in the UK, because that's the only way to keep the wages down, because that's the only way that the only model that the state supply funds. It's just really got to stop, and it is a gender point. But I think to take that into a kind of policy perspective, I mean, at the RSA, we've been pushing UBI for a long time. Before I joined the RSA, and I was pushing predominantly the Danish flexicurity. It doesn't really matter. The challenge is that work no longer guarantees economic security. 1 in 8 people in the UK who work are in poverty. That's the epochal challenge. Now, technology is part of that, and technology will mean that the labour market gets restructured as technology becomes available and changes the sexual composition. That's why we need active labour market systems, and I particularly like the Swedish model. But it really comes back to worker power and a safety net that can make sure that work does guarantee economic security. So UBI, Danish flexicurity, I don't really mind, as long as there is a floor that is generous enough to mean that people can say no to bad work.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alan. So we've just got a few minutes left here. I just want to thank our panelists for their contributions today. Obviously, just a small conversation, and we'll see where this goes. I'm personally definitely heartened by this conversation. It feels like, for the first time, there's a real emotional embodiment around progressive values that I haven't seen in a while, that we had been, previously hijacked by, Chicago economists and the sort of bifurcation that Tara sketched out between those who cared about workers and those who cared about economics. And so to see those communities in closer conversation is really heartening. Just want to thank everyone for joining. Those in the audience, do check out Tara's latest book that's just come out around public interest technology, and look forward to continuing this conversation in our different contexts. But thanks so much to our panelists, and thank you to our attendees.